No one in the courtroom expected what happened next. The doors swung open with a confidence that didn't match the quiet seriousness of the municipal chamber, and for a moment, every conversation died mid-sentence. Judge Frank Caprio looked up from the stack of cases before him, his pen frozen, his eyes narrowing slightly, not out of judgment but curiosity. A young man stepped in with the swagger of someone used to being admired, someone used to being recognized. And yet something about the way he carried that confidence felt out of place. It wasn't arrogance exactly. It was something else, something rehearsed, something hiding a deeper tremble. And the moment he lifted his sunglasses off his face and approached the stand, the entire room realized this case was going to be different. The clerk called out his name, Evan Rourke. A murmur moved across the courtroom. The last name wasn't an ordinary one in this city. It belonged to someone widely respected, almost mythic in local law enforcement circles. Evan's father, Detective Michael Rourke, had been the city's symbol of grit, sacrifice, and unshakable moral backbone. But the young man standing before the judge did not look like the son of a legend. He looked like a kid who enjoyed attention far more than discipline. The charge was simple on paper: reckless driving, failure to comply at a traffic stop, disrespectful conduct toward an officer. But the mood in the courtroom felt tense, unsettled. People leaned in closer. Something was off. Something unspoken hovered over the case like fog. Even in the way Evan shifted his weight, even in the defiant smile he kept trying to maintain, there was a fracture forming around the edges. Judge Caprio watched him closely, silently taking in the details. The young man's shoulders were squared as if preparing for war, but his breathing was uneven. His hands were tucked into the pockets of an expensive jacket, yet the thumb on his right hand kept tapping against his leg, rhythmic, anxious, betraying nerves he was trying desperately to hide. Judge Caprio removed his glasses, placing them gently on the bench. "Good morning, Mr. Rourke." Evan nodded stiffly, almost like a nod used to end conversations, not begin them. There was a moment of stillness. A courtroom carries its own kind of silence, one that holds weight, expectation, responsibility. And in that silence, Judge Caprio felt something tighten inside him. This wasn't just another young man with a ticket. The posture, the bravado, the forced confidence. He'd seen it all before, in defendants who were breaking under pressures nobody else could see. But he had also seen something else: sons of strong men who struggled to live beneath the shadows cast by their fathers. Frank Caprio leaned back slightly, his voice warm but steady. "I understand you were stopped for reckless driving on Mineral Spring Avenue. The officer notes in his report that you refused to lower your window at first. Then, when you did, you told him—" He paused, scanning the page, then lifted his eyes to meet Evan's. "That he should know who you are." A soft ripple of muffled commentary swept through the courtroom benches. Evan stiffened, jaw tightening. Judge Caprio continued, "Would you like to explain that statement?" For the first time, the young man's composure faltered. His throat moved with a hard swallow. He shifted again, standing straighter, trying to reclaim that earlier posture. "Misunderstanding," Evan muttered. "He was being aggressive. I was just clarifying." The judge's brows lifted ever so slightly. Clarifying. It was a word people used when they wanted to be right without admitting they'd been wrong. But Frank didn't press. Not yet. Inside, Judge Caprio felt an old and familiar pull, the moral instinct to dig deeper, to see the human story beneath the surface. He knew something was brewing here. He could feel it in the way Evan avoided eye contact, in the way he exhaled sharply whenever someone whispered behind him, in the way he seemed to brace himself against the courtroom's judgment even before anything had truly begun. He adjusted his robe, glanced over at the bailiff, then returned his gaze to the young man. "Mr. Rourke, I'm sure you understand that the courtroom is a place of accountability. Respect is essential, not for me." He tapped his chest lightly, but for the law, and for the officers who try to keep our community safe. Something flickered in Evan's expression, an emotion quickly hidden. "And I say this," Judge Caprio added gently, "with full respect to your father's service." The room shifted again. Evan's jaw clenched harder. There it was, the fracture line, the invisible bruise. The judge could see it now. This wasn't a case about a traffic stop. This was a collision between a young man's identity and the impossible weight of a last name. Judge Caprio cleared his throat, softening his tone. "Tell me something, Evan. Were you in a hurry that morning? Something important happening?" A pause. A long one. Evan's eyes dropped for the first time since he entered the courtroom. "No," he said quietly. Too quietly. A lie or deflection. Frank couldn't tell yet. He nodded slowly. "All right. Let's take this one step at a time." But as Frank continued the procedural questions, something stirred in the young man. A tremor. His responses grew shorter, colder. His breathing quickened. It was as if each question pulled him closer to something he was terrified to say aloud. And then, when Judge Caprio asked about the final comment Evan allegedly made, "My father never took orders from cops like you," the young man's facade cracked. Evan inhaled sharply, his eyes suddenly shining with a heat that wasn't anger. It was something more raw, almost like grief. The courtroom sensed it. Heads tilted. A murmur died mid-breath. Judge Caprio's eyes softened instantly. He leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. "Evan, what's really going on here?" The young man blinked hard, trying to hold his composure. His throat tightened. His breath stuttered. That celebrity-like swagger that had carried him into the room evaporated, leaving behind a 19-year-old kid standing alone beneath fluorescent lights that felt too bright. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, in a voice strained and trembling, he finally whispered, "My father doesn't even remember my name anymore." The courtroom froze. Judge Caprio didn't move, didn't breathe. Those words hit the air like a stone breaking glass. The son of a legendary detective, a man adored by the city, a hero, a symbol, and yet behind closed doors, a family drowning in the fog of a fading mind. Evan swallowed again, wiping his face with the back of his hand, embarrassed by his own emotion. He used to teach me everything about respect, about discipline, and now he doesn't even know who I am. So when that officer stopped me and talked to me like I was nobody, it just—" He broke off, shaking his head. "It just hit me wrong." His voice dissolved. Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Human. Judge Caprio felt the weight settle in his chest. He had seen tragedy. He had witnessed grief. But the quiet heartbreak of watching a parent disappear while still alive, that was a different kind of pain. And now he understood. This wasn't arrogance. It was a young man drowning in the grief of losing a father who hadn't died, but was disappearing piece by piece. Judge Caprio exhaled slowly, compassion etching deeper into his features. He leaned back, eyes thoughtful, steady, warm. "Evan," he said softly, "thank you for your honesty." But this case was just beginning. For a long moment, no one in the courtroom moved. Evan stood alone at the center of a silence thick enough to feel. Even the officer who had written the citation, seated quietly in the back, shifted uncomfortably, his expression softening with a hint of regret. Judge Caprio rested his hands on the bench, fingers interlaced. His voice came out quiet, almost fatherly. "Evan, how long has your father been struggling?" The young man hesitated, biting the inside of his cheek, fighting back another wave of emotion. "A year," he whispered. "But the last few months, it's been getting worse. He forgets where he is. He forgets what day it is. Some mornings he wakes up and thinks he's still on duty." Evan's voice thinned. He used to call me his partner. Now he thinks I'm a neighbor." The courtroom felt his words. Every syllable landed with the weight of a life unraveling. Judge Caprio inhaled deeply, his gaze lowering as memories flickered in the back of his mind. He had seen Michael Rourke in court many times over the decades, firm, meticulous, unwavering in his pursuit of justice, a man whose presence could quiet even the loudest room. And now, to imagine that same man lost inside the fog of his own mind, it tugged at something deep inside the judge's chest. "What you're describing," Frank said gently, "is one of the hardest burdens a family can face." Evan looked up, his eyes pleading for something he couldn't even name. Frank leaned forward. "But tell me, Evan, how does that connect to the way you spoke to the officer during the stop?" The young man's chest rose with a trembling breath. His jaw worked, fighting to put chaotic emotions into words. "When he pulled me over," Evan began, "he talked to me like I was just another reckless kid. And maybe I was, but His voice cracked. "I've spent my whole life watching people thank my father for protecting them. Everywhere we went, someone shook his hand. Someone admired him." He swallowed hard. "And now he's a stranger in his own house. People don't see him anymore. They don't see what he was. They don't know he's slipping away." He forced out a shaky sigh. "So, when that officer spoke to me like I didn't matter, something inside me snapped. I said what I said because, for a moment, I wanted to matter to someone. I wanted someone to remember what my dad used to be. Who he used to be." Emotion twisted through his expression, raw and unfiltered. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Inside, a quiet ache unfurled. Loss comes in many forms, but losing someone who still sits at the dinner table, that is a sorrow few understand. "And that morning," Evan added, "I just had to explain to him, again, why he couldn't drive anymore. It's the third time this week he's tried to take the keys." His voice shook. "He looked at me like I was stealing something from him, like I was betraying him." A tight breath left him. "So I left the house angry, confused, not thinking straight." Frank's eyes softened even more. "And you took that pain with you onto the road?" "Yeah," Evan whispered. A moment passed. Slow, heavy, full. Then Judge Caprio spoke again, his tone gentle but precise. "Evan, grief doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like anger, or recklessness, or trying too hard to be someone the world will notice, because someone dear to you no longer can." Evan blinked rapidly, fighting not to break in front of a room filled with strangers. Frank's gaze moved over the papers on his bench, though his thoughts drifted far beyond them. He imagined Detective Rourke sitting in a quiet living room, staring blankly at family photos he no longer recognized. He thought of the years the man had given. Cold nights on patrol, missed dinners, sacrifices the public never saw. And now, after all that service, his own mind had turned against him. It wasn't fair. Life rarely was. But the law wasn't about feelings. It was about truth, context, and responsibility. And this case held all three in fragile balance. Judge Caprio straightened slightly. "I want to hear from the officer who issued the citation." Heads turned as Officer Delgado rose from the back row. A sturdy man in his late 30s, he walked forward with a measured pace, stopping near the railing. He gave a respectful nod to the judge. "Officer Delgado," Caprio said, "thank you for stepping forward. I'd appreciate your perspective on the incident." Delgado cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor." He clasped his hands behind his back. "That morning, Mr. Rourke was driving over the limit. When I pulled him over, he kept the window up, and when he finally lowered it, he seemed irritated. I could sense attitude, but—" He hesitated, his eyes shifting toward Evan. "I also sensed something else. He looked distressed, like he wasn't fully present." Caprio nodded. "And the comment he made?" The officer sighed. He did tell me I should know who he was, and he mentioned his father, but not in a bragging way, honestly. It sounded more like frustration and hurt. He shifted his weight. When I asked for his license, his hand was shaking. I remember thinking he looked like someone who hadn't slept. Evan looked surprised. You noticed that? Delgado nodded. I've seen a lot of grief in this job. A lot of people who don't know where to put their pain. A wave of softness moved across the courtroom. Understanding began to settle where irritation once was. Judge Caprio leaned forward. Officer Delgado, do you feel Mr. Rourke posed a threat that morning, beyond the speeding? The officer shook his head. No, Your Honor. He was emotional, not dangerous. Frank exhaled slowly. Thank you, officer. You may step back. As Delgado returned to his seat, Caprio looked at Evan again, this time with a deeper, fuller understanding. Evan, Frank said thoughtfully, your behavior that morning was unacceptable, but unacceptable behavior often has understandable reasons. Evan looked down, shoulders drooping. I know, I shouldn't have spoken to him like that. I snapped. Grief will do that, Frank murmured. Then he paused. A long, contemplative silence stretched between them. The courtroom leaned into it, sensing something important approaching. He studied the young man for a long moment, then asked quietly, Evan, what scares you most about your father's condition? Evan's eyes reddened instantly. His voice came out barely audible. That one day, when I go into his room, he won't even know he has a son. The room shifted. A collective ache rippled through the air. And the second thing? Caprio asked gently. Evan swallowed painfully. That I'm not the kind of son he would be proud of. There it was, the true core, the wound behind the anger, the fear beneath the arrogance. Caprio felt something inside himself twist. This wasn't a case anymore. It was a young man's desperate attempt not to disappear in the shadow of fading memories. Frank's inner voice, seasoned by decades of human stories, whispered, This boy isn't looking for a way out of a ticket. He's looking for a way back to himself. The judge rested back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. He folded his hands again, not out of formality but out of gravity. A decision was forming, not yet fully shaped, not yet ready to be spoken, but it was rising inside him like a tide. Evan, he said softly, before I make my ruling, I need to ask you one more question. Evan lifted his head. When you walked into this courtroom today, Frank said, why did you come in like that? Sunglasses, posture, bravado. Who were you trying to be? Evan blinked, startled by the question. His mouth moved, but no words came at first. Finally, he whispered, someone my dad would still recognize. The entire courtroom felt those words like a punch to the heart. Caprio's chest tightened. For a moment he had to look down, steadying himself. He had been on the bench a long time, but moments like this, moments that exposed the fragile human condition, always found a way to reach him. He looked up again, eyes warm, voice low and steady. Evan, he said, your father may forget your name. He may forget the moments you shared, but he will never forget the kind of man he hoped you would become. Because that part, the moral compass he tried to give you, isn't stored in his memory. He tapped his chest lightly. It's stored in yours. A tear rolled down Evan's cheek before he could wipe it away, but the emotional turning point was still approaching. The biggest truth, the hardest truth, had not yet surfaced. Judge Caprio sensed it, and soon he would uncover it. The courtroom had fallen into one of those rare silences where no one dared move, as if even breathing too loudly might break the emotional current running through the room. Evan stood there, no swagger, no sunglasses, no protective armor, just a young man trying not to drown in the truth he had suppressed for months. Judge Caprio watched him carefully, the weight of decades of service settling over his shoulders. But Frank sensed something else, a deeper truth. Something Evan was still holding back. He'd seen it before. The slight hesitation, the way a person looked away at the precise moment their soul wanted to be seen. And it was happening now. He leaned forward, his voice calm but probing. "Evan, is there something you haven't told me yet?" The young man stilled. His jaw tightened. For a moment, he didn't speak. When he finally lifted his eyes, they were glossy, torn between fear and relief. "There is," he whispered. The room tensed. Caprio nodded. "Take your time." Evan inhaled shakily, his shoulders trembling. "My dad. He didn't just forget who I was." His voice thinned. "He doesn't remember who he was." The judge's brows lowered softly. "Explain that to me." Evan swallowed hard. He has these moments where he thinks he's still a detective, and he tries to leave the house to go to work. Sometimes he thinks he's chasing someone. Sometimes he thinks he's lost. We have to keep the doors locked now. His breath hitched. Last month, he walked out in the middle of the night. He was barefoot, confused. He didn't know the street. He didn't even know his own name. A ripple of heartbreak moved through the room. Even the officers shifted, their training unable to shield them from the raw human pain in Evan's voice. Frank's throat tightened. He had handled thousands of cases, but this was the kind of pain only life could right. Evan continued, his voice trembling. When the police found him, he was crying. My dad, the toughest man I've ever known, crying like a child. And when they brought him home, he paused, choking back a sob. He asked me if I knew his son. He said he heard he was a good kid. And then, he took a sharp breath. He asked me if I thought his son missed him. Silence shattered into a quiet gasp from a woman in the back row. Evan wiped his eyes quickly, ashamed of the tears. So, when Officer Delgado talked to me like I was just another screw-up, his voice broke entirely. It reminded me of how my dad looks at me now, like he's looking at a stranger. He covered his face with both hands. A long, still beat passed. Something deep inside Judge Caprio shifted. The story wasn't just about grief now. It was about a young man breaking under the weight of losing someone who was still alive, but disappearing piece by piece. Frank's own memories flickered. Years ago, he had watched a close relative fade under the same merciless conditions. He remembered the confusion, the fear, the helplessness, the way a family's world collapses one forgotten memory at a time. Inside him, empathy swelled, and with it came a fierce determination to guide this young man back toward himself. He leaned forward, voice gentle but commanding. "Evan, look at me." The young man lowered his hands, eyes red, chest trembling. "What you are carrying," Frank said softly, "is a grief most people will never understand until they live it themselves. And that grief is twisting you, confusing you, pulling you into someone you are not." He paused. "Your father's illness is not your failure. His memory fading is not because you are unworthy. It is because life can be cruel in ways that make no sense." His voice softened further. "But losing pieces of him does not mean you must lose yourself." Another tear slid down Evan's cheek. Judge Caprio continued. "When you spoke to Officer Delgado the way you did, you weren't being disrespectful. You were being overwhelmed. But overwhelmed people must still choose who they want to be." Evan nodded slowly, trembling. Frank took a breath, letting the weight of the moment settle before continuing. "I want to share something with you," he said gently. "When I was a young man, I watched someone I loved forget my name. Forget the stories we shared. Forget the years we lived side by side. And I learned something from that pain. Memories fade, but values do not." Evan's eyes widened slightly, absorbing every word. Your father taught you to be strong, respectful, responsible. Those lessons are not lost just because he can no longer say them. Frank tapped his chest again. They are inside you, and in moments like the one at that traffic stop, you must choose whether to honor the man he was or collapse under the fear of losing him. Evan blinked, stunned by the clarity, the wisdom, the compassion woven into each sentence. Frank leaned back, exhaling deeply. "I have thought long and hard about what is appropriate here," he said. "I consider the law, the safety of the community, your behavior that morning, and, just as important, your honesty today." The entire courtroom braced. Judge Caprio's voice deepened with resolve. "Mr. Rourke, for the speeding charge, I am going to reduce the fine to $25. For the failure to comply and disrespectful conduct, I am going to dismiss the charges." A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Evan's eyes widened, disbelieving. You're dismissing them?" "Yes," Frank said firmly, "not because of who your father is, not because of sympathy, but because I believe in accountability that heals, not accountability that crushes." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But," he continued, "there is one condition." Evan straightened. Frank's voice softened again. "When you go home today, sit with your father. Even if he doesn't recognize you, even if it hurts, tell him something about yourself he would have been proud of, something that reflects the man you are becoming, not the boy who walked in here trying to be seen." Another tear rolled down Evan's cheek. This time, he didn't wipe it away. Judge Caprio closed the file gently. "Your father may forget many things, but you can choose not to forget the values he lived by. Live them loud enough, and long enough, that one day, when someone says your name, people remember the same strength they once saw in him." Evan nodded through tears, unable to speak. Frank offered one final piece of wisdom, softly, almost like a blessing. "Respect," he said, "is not something you demand. It is something you practice, especially when the world feels unfair. And the truest test of character isn't how you behave when life is easy. It's how you behave when your heart is breaking." Evan lowered his head, overwhelmed with emotion, but for the first time that day, he looked lighter, like someone who had been carrying too much for too long, finally setting down a piece of the burden. The judge gave him a gentle nod. "You're dismissed, Evan, and I hope you find peace in the days ahead." The young man stepped back from the podium, not with swagger, not with bravado, but with quiet humility. As he turned to leave, Officer Delgado gave him a respectful nod. Evan paused, then nodded back, sincerely this time. The courtroom remained silent as he walked out, not because they judged him, but because they understood him. Judge Caprio watched him go, the faintest hint of a sad smile touching his face. In his heart, one final truth echoed. Sometimes the hardest lessons in life are not about punishment, but about becoming the person someone believed we could be.